said. It just reveals to us. He just reveals to us that there was some type of a contention between Gideon and Ephraim. It could possibly be, some commentators have stated that because Ephraim and Manasseh were considered one tribe, and in chapter 6, Gideon calls upon Manasseh rather than Ephraim, Ephraim was offended by that. The tribe of Ephraim was offended by that. Whatever the case, we're not told. The only thing we're told is that Gideon points out to the men of Ephraim that they played one of the most important parts of this battle by pursuing these Midianite enemies and killing them, and thus scattering the rest of the army. And what Gideon tells them obviously squelches their anger, because the men end up leaving Gideon in peace and going back. And then in verses 4 through 9 of chapter 8, we see that Gideon and his band continue their pursuit of the remaining Midianite army, and we're told that there's two kings, specifically Zebah and Zalmunna. And these guys have about 15,000 men left out of the original 200,000 men that had been originally a part of the army. And these men apparently flee from the hill country of Ephraim into the territory of Gad. And so Gideon continues to pursue them and kind of focusing on these two men in particular. So Gideon comes. They come to the town of Sukkoth, which again is in the territory of Gad. And Gideon makes a request. He sees that his men are exhausted. He sees that they're weary. He sees that they need some kind of sustenance, something to eat, something to refresh their strength. And the men of Sukkoth answer Gideon and say, well, you haven't even done what you're supposed to do yet. So why should we give you and your men something to eat until you accomplish this task? Are these kings in your hands yet? Hey, basically they were saying, when you bring us the kings, we'll give you the provision. We're not told, the author is silent, why the men of Gad or why the men of Sukkoth responded this way. We have no idea why. We don't know anything about the situation. But whatever the case, Gideon reproves them, and he tells them when he comes back, when God has given these kings into his hand, and God will give the kings into his hand, that he will return and he will bring retribution to this town. So Gideon then continues on into the town of Penuel. And there he makes the same request. So we can assume that the towns were pretty close together. But yet we find that the men of Penuel answer Gideon in the exact same way. So Gideon, again, like in Sukkoth, promises to come back and bring punishment onto these men of the town of Penuel. And then, in verses 10 through 21, we finally see that Gideon achieves his victory. He captures the two men, the two kings. He parades them, as it was also often accustomed to do, parades them. But he goes back to the town of Sukkoth. And on the way there, he captures a young man from that town, and he procures from that young man the names of the 70 elders of that town. And we're told that when Gideon goes back, he parades the men into the town. He brings out the 70 elders, and he whips them with briars and thorns, just as he had promised to do. And basically that was just an embarrassment, something that would have been set shame on these town elders. And then we see Gideon going back to Penuel. Now in Penuel, he does something a little bit different. He breaks down the tower, and he kills all the men in the city. Now, the reason for that, again, we don't know. Whether they were a little bit harsher than the men of Sukkoth, or whether Gideon was just making an example, we don't know. But for some reason, he punished the men of Sukkoth differently than he punished the men of Penuel. Then we're told that Gideon kills these men through his son. He asks his son, his oldest son, to kill him. His son is scared. And so the kings basically tell him, hey, look, if you're a real man, do it yourself. And this happens. Then we're told that the land had rest for 40 years. And if this was the only thing that was left in Gideon's life, we could end it here, and we could say, wow, Gideon was a wonderful man of God, a great man of God. He did everything that God had wanted him to do. But unfortunately, the rest of the chapter, from verses 22 to 35, is very, very candid about the last incidents in Gideon's life. And that's the text that we need to focus on this morning. So the first thing I want to look at is in verses 22 through 26. I'm going to read it very quickly. It says, "The men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian.' Gideon said to them, 'I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you, but the Lord will rule over you.' And Gideon said to them, 'Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil.' For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, 'We will willingly give them.' And they spread a cloak, and every man threw it in the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels." So the first thing we see in verses 22 through 26 is Gideon's piety. So after all is said and done, the people now hail Gideon as their hero. Gideon is the champion. He has come and rescued Israel from the oppressive hand of Midian. And we have to remember the cruelty of the people of Midian. The people of Midian and the peoples of the east would lie in wait in the hills right until the harvest time. And they would swoop down right as the harvest was coming in, and they would literally just take all of the food. So there would absolutely be nothing left of the food. The people were actually living in caves and under the ground, just trying to scratch for a bite to eat. And as a matter of fact, we see Gideon himself at the very beginning when God calls him in the wine press, which was not the usual place to thresh wheat. He was in a wine press because it was a little bit lower into the ground, and it was harder to see from up on a hill. You wouldn't be able to see into it. And so we find Gideon himself threshing wheat inside the wine press to keep these Midians and these men of the east from taking the food. And so he has crushed the enemy with God's help. But then they come to Gideon and they say, "Hey, why don't you rule over us? You, your son, and your grandson." And basically what they were asking for is that Gideon would establish a type of monarchy. Now, don't read the text and think that they're asking Gideon and his son and his grandson all to rule simultaneously together. No, what they're asking is that Gideon would be the founder and establisher of the monarchy of Israel and then pass that down the line from father to son. In short, what Israel wanted was to be like the nations around them. This was one of the very things that God had commanded them that they should not do. Now, we don't actually see the full fruition of this request of Israel to be a monarchy come into play until later on. And if you remember in Samuel the prophet, as he is nearing the end of his life in the book of 2 Samuel, in the book of 1 Samuel, he is nearing the end of his life. And he is getting old, and the people come to Samuel. And they say, "Hey, you're getting old now. Your sons, they're no good. They're not walking in the way of the Lord. Who's going to lead us? Give us a king." And what does Samuel do? We're told in the book of 1 Samuel that he is grieved at their request. Why was he grieved? I mean, it seemed like a reasonable request. Well, the fact was that Israel all along was supposed to be a theocracy, not a monarchy. In other words, God would raise up human, competent leaders to protect the people and to lead them into battle when necessary. But overall, it would be God who ruled over them. They would not need a human king to tell them what to do. And so Samuel was grieved at this fact that they asked for this king. And he goes and he falls on his face before God. And God's response to him is, "Samuel, They are not rejecting you. They are rejecting me as king. And so God tells them, give them what they want. But you warn them. Warn them what their king and following kings after them are going to do. They're going to take your sons and send them to war. They're going to take whatever of your daughters that they wish and defile them. They're going to take your cattle. They're going to basically burden you with taxes. And so Samuel goes back and he tells the people what God says. And what is the people's response? They say, no, but give us a king. And what's the reason? When you read it, they say, because we want to be like the nations around us. They were throwing off what they thought as chains of God's rule over them in order to establish their own rule. Our souls naturally crave freedom from that which we deem to be binding. We desire to be like the others that are around us. The world's delicacies, we look at them and we see them and we're tempted by them. The things of this world. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17 warns us plainly that whoever loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Love not the world nor any of the things in the world, for all that is in the world. And how does he describe what's in the world? The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life. It's not so much the material possessions that are the snare. It is our own souls and how we perceive our need of those material things. And in these temptations, we forsake the rule of God over us and run after, as it were, or to use what the author of Judges uses, to whore after these things and begin to neglect the rule of God over our lives. Peter commands us in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, to fight these temptations and to fight these passions. He says in 1 Peter 2:11, he says, Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. These temptations to shake off God and to go after other things, it is more than just a temptation. What is at stake are our very souls. Peter says that they are waging war against our souls. Yet we're told in our culture to get whatever you can get. We are told in our culture to have it our way. We have become the Burger King and McDonald's mentality people. We want it our way, and when we get it our way, we're loving it. That's what the culture feeds us. And so because of this, we have a tendency to be lax in our spiritual disciplines. We have a tendency to just kind of shake off things that seem a little unimportant to us at the moment. Well, hey, I went to church twice this week. Why do I need to spend time in God's Word? Well, why do I need to pray? I don't really have time to pray anyway, so, I'll just pray whenever. The Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli put it best when he said this. He said, the Christian life then is a battle so sharp and full of danger that effort can nowhere be relaxed without loss. Did you hear that? We cannot be lax anywhere in our spirituality without suffering some kind of loss. The loss may not be visible at the moment. We may not recognize it at the time. But over time, as we look back, we will really begin to see the effect that it has taken upon our very souls. And this is the very thing that Peter warned his readers of. These things, these temptations, these passions wage war against our soul. And when we shake off the theocracy of God over our souls and our bodies, this is what we end up with. Just like the people of Israel, whoring after the things of the world. deeming those